Hi students, this is a video that's going to help us understand what shooting in RAW format means, and from this point in the course you're going to want to shoot in this format. So we're shifting away from our JPEG format on our cameras, and that's the recording of digital data in a certain compressed format called JPEG. We're going to move to an uncompressed format called RAW format. Now, the first thing I want to point out, and I went to the Wikipedia page for this, is to give you a sense of generally how complicated or technical this term can be and how intimidating that can sound. But I tend to think of things that are technical as typically very well documented. So I'm not going to go through all of this. I don't think it's incredibly necessary unless you want to dive a little or a lot deeper into the minutia of file formats. I do think it's beneficial to know sooner than later about shooting in RAW format, because I think once you start and want to take your images seriously, this is what you're going to want to move into shooting. And I think it's a commitment, but very worth it when you boil down what capabilities it offers you. So the recording from our digital sensors to a memory card takes when that data transfers, some cameras, if you set it to, for instance, we happen to JPEG, it compresses that image and that data and takes out what generally most people don't need or want in an image, with the assumption that you're going to be using it for web purposes, for smaller photo prints, or for less professional work. RAW format is going to not compress and not take any of the data away from that, and it's going to transfer everything that's captured to that sensor to your card. So that does mean that two major things: your file sizes are going to increase dramatically, meaning you're going from a few megabytes often with a JPEG to maybe 20-25 megabytes per file with a camera raw image, depending on your camera. Now, again, this is all very well documented. I'm going to attach some videos on shooting in RAW so you can dive into that briefly if you like. The other thing to know, especially since not all of us are using the same cameras, the extension like .jpeg or .tiff for a RAW file is going to vary depending on what camera make and model you're using, usually make. So Nikon has its own file extension. Let's see if it lists. I feel like I remember it listing down here. Yeah, so Sony has its own kind, .arw files, or Canon has .crw files. Nikon has .nef or nef files, and so on and so forth. You'll see some cameras will have .raw, but in general, they're all competing, and they're not all exactly the same. So different companies tout that their RAW files are more robust than others. So all of that again gets into very minutia zones and stuff that I'm not as concerned about that you know. So I'm going to go through the workflow of taking a file and assuming that you have your files shot in RAW and are going to be imported into Adobe Bridge. I'm going to go through a file that I've taken in RAW and take us through editing in what's called Camera Raw. So I'm going to jump over here to Bridge. I have an image here that I'm going to use. It's of my youngest son, and you'll notice that it's highlighted here you have two ways of getting the camera raw. You can open in camera raw by clicking this icon right here that looks like an aperture, or you can double click a raw file within Bridge, Adobe Bridge, and it'll automatically open what's called camera raw. Okay, now this is going to be a gateway application to Photoshop, which does not read raw files. It needs camera raw first in order to process that data in order for it to then be readable by Photoshop. Don't ask me why. I'm sure there's some wonderful technical reason. It's just the process, and often, again, I think I put it in that category of most people don't want to dive this deep into the technical facets of photography, so they offer up those through camera raw and through this application to more professional or serious photographers, but leave it out for most people who just want to maybe utilize Photoshop for very basic use. So we're in camera raw right now. It tells me what camera I used, tells me what the file name is. It's got some of the similar interfaces that we understand. What I want to show here is we have our tool pane to the left here, and then what we have at the very top is a histogram, okay, and then we have a series of settings that we can customize for this image. Now, one of the things that's really unique and why camera raw is so wonderful for people who want total control over their the data of their images is that it gives you the unprocessed data, so you can shoot images with a little bit more leeway and latitude in terms of exposure, knowing that most likely you got the information you needed and you can recover it in Adobe Raw, okay, Adobe or Camera Raw. So that's something to know and understand, because a lot of that data gets compressed and ditched when you're using formats like JPEG, but here it's all available to us. So we have a lot of latitude for how we can edit this image in Camera Raw before we take it to that creative phase in Photoshop. So what I'm going to go through is just demo here. I'm going to explain this histogram up here and some of the things that I would recommend doing right off the bat. But I want to redirect us real quick to where I'm going to be following some of the guides of our workflow document right here. So this workflow document under our classwork, it's under logistics and materials. This PDF, right, if you go down to our Camera Raw, I walk us through what I think are the basic steps that I would do before taking this image into Photoshop. All right, so go ahead and make sure you follow this if that helps. And this video obviously is going to do the same thing. Something I recommend is if you download this file, the table of contents becomes active, so you can select Camera Raw here and it'll jump and take you right there if you care to do that. It doesn't for some reason want to do that in the web browser here. I'm not able to use it that way, but just know that that's available. Now at the very top here, oh sorry, yeah, here we go, this histogram, I want to explain real quick again some technical facets of a histogram and why it's important to utilize it in terms of exposure. Our histogram is a digital output of our exposure reading and is much more accurate than looking at the back of your camera when you're photographing, for instance, primarily because the back of your camera, that LCD screen that displays a preview of your image, is often misleading because it's a backlit image, right? It's a screen that's backlit, and that doesn't give you a proper visual of your exposure. Whereas the digital facets of that, the reading of that in a graph form doesn't lie, all right? Now, when you're looking at this graph, the ways that I remember how to read this graph, because it doesn't show here how to read it, and it doesn't show that in your camera either. It doesn't have a reading out of which side is dark, which side is light. The way that I easily remember it is that a lot of people like to shoot black and white photography, BW, right? Black and white. Black is to the left, white is to the right, okay? Black, white. And everything between is we've got darker to medium gray to light, right? So we have this gradation, and the graph measures that gradation, but then it also, in height here, shows you the density of pixels in those areas. So this image, for instance, is going to be a darker leaning image that has a lot of black and darker tonalities and values within that image. All right, and you can see this is a 2 stops underexposed image, and you can see that darkness is dominating. Now, when this graph leaves, or the reading leaves this graph, we're going to call that clipping in photography. That's when your graph, your histogram is clipping, and that's when you're losing information in those areas. So right now we're losing information. There's unreadable data and information in our shadow areas or darkest areas of this image. And you can see when we go to overexposure, it's spiking and clipping in the highlights where we're losing that same information, but in the white areas or the lightest areas of our image. All right. Now, if I jump over here and read this histogram, what that tells me, and I'm going to go ahead and select these triangles up here, that's when it's going to show me where clipping is occurring. So I'll show you right here. It gives me the ISO, the angle, the aperture, shutter speed. I'm going to select right here under edit. I'm going to select auto. Notice, by the way, just for your information, that you can also instantly turn this image black and white right there. But I can go to auto. Okay. And what it's going to do is it's going to brighten up those shadow areas. Okay. Then it's also, though, showing me a preview in my darkest area where I'm losing information. So in this grate that's registered, that's at the base of this floor, I'm losing information in those deepest shadow areas. All right. Now, I'm not losing or having any clipping in my highlights, but I'm going to show you how that works here in a second. Now, white balance here, you have the ability to custom white balance by selecting this tool and picking an area in the image. But you can also go through what are similar to settings in your camera where you can select the light mode. So if I said, you know what, there's a lot of daylight in this image, what would daylight do? It's going to cool that image. If I did auto, what would it think? It wants to warm that image. Right? But there's probably in this situation competing fluorescent and daylight. So but fluorescent's probably going to be, so that the dominant light source here is daylight most likely. All right. Now I can also just choose as shot, which in my case makes it warmer. And I can see some yellow tones that I think might be out of place, but I can always then correct that in Photoshop as well. Now here you'll notice that it felt like my image was underexposed, so it overexposed me a half a stop. It's adding some contrast, it's taking away some highlights, it's adding shadow exposure and information in those dark areas, it's increasing the whites in my image, and it's decreasing the blacks. So I'm going to go through and show you what happens when I play with these. So if I go this direction, you can see that clipping increases. Okay, so if I deselect this, right, you can see that underexposure. Now keep in mind, overexposure is more of your enemy in photography, because it's much harder to come back from the overexposed areas than it is from the underexposed. So if I overexpose, you can see what happens. I'm going to bring this back relatively close to what I had. Now notice this. There's a real evenness across this histogram from black to white. There's even representation. See how it says shadows, exposure, highlights, whites. Okay. Now, if I increase my contrast, it's going to want to separate that. Okay. And see how it's starting to lose its midtones here and push toward an ultimate, what would I say, dominance of black and white, right? It's leaning toward that. That's what an increase in contrast. The opposite is if I flatten this image, I'm pulling away from those edges and increasing in my midtones. Okay. Now, highlights, if I take those away, it flattens it. If I increase those highlight areas, jump. Now I haven't started clipping yet, but watch what if I increase my contrast. See those red areas that start to build on that sill right here? Those are moments of a total loss of information. Okay, so I can't recover anything there. All right, now I'm gonna go back to auto here and make it easy. Shadows, increase in shadows. Right, notice how I'm getting rid of some of that, but at the expense of maybe washing out my image some. Okay, so you gotta be careful that you're not washing out maybe in those highlight areas when I add shadow information. Or whites, I'm pulling away, I'm flattening, increasing, okay, and then blacks. Notice that I like to pull just away from this clipping at all. It won't always work, so that one single line is probably inconsequential in this image. It doesn't really exist very in any dominant way that's even visible. Okay. Now let me go back. I'm going to select auto, and I'm going to show you up here too. I can just click and pull in those areas as well. Click and pull. And notice it's pulling from down here. So I can pull away slightly there and say, you know what, I want a little less there. Now I'm gonna take us down here. You can change the temperature if you know exactly what the temperature of your light source is. We'll get a little more in depth with that as we move along. Okay, now down here you can also experiment with, this is your curves control, which I think is a more advanced way of doing some of the exposure up here. Okay, more specific and advanced, to where you can really kind of consider certain types of exposure or graphing of your tones and values. But I'm not going to touch base on this because I think it's a little bit more advanced. And the only last thing I want to show you, which I think is a little bit of an explanation that I don't want to bore you with necessarily, but there is, again, a lot of camera models out there, and each camera model is kind of trying to shape their own type of digital hardware and software that they use for their cameras and blah 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 blah. Now every lens that is used with any camera, digital camera today, is set up with what's called a profile, and Adobe installs and tries to keep up to date with all those profiles, and then when you bring in a file, it tries to match that lens profile with what the application displays for you. So in this case, it automatically, Sony's really good at this. It embeds that metadata in your file, and then when you import it into Adobe Bridge and open it up in Camera Raw, it reads that and tries to correct for any distortion or vignetting that happens in reading that data. Now, I know that sounds complex, but I've had cameras in the past where I pull it in a raw image and it'll look really vignetted, and I think, oh no, there's something broken, right? Something's wrong with my camera. And what I've realized is that the profile either didn't load, or Adobe doesn't actually have the profile built into the application. And I've had to actually go search for people who have built and make available profiles for those cameras or those lenses that I can then bring into Camera Raw, and it can read it properly. So it reads it based on what I actually shot and saw. Okay, so if you're having any doubts about your image not recording properly or opening properly, that might be one of the reasons. Now, most of us won't really notice, but if I take that away, look what happens. See how it gets darker and vignettes around those edges? It also slightly distorts. Do you see that? Now, this is one of those things that I show you because I was really bummed that I didn't learn about this till much later in my education with Adobe, but it's become one of the more critical things that I insist on not only using myself, but people that my students use who use Camera Raw, because it can dramatically change not only the image that you're editing and how you see it, but how it records. Alright, you can also play around with customizing that distortion and making it how you like. So I can kind of tweak and distort things if I want to, but I'm gonna go ahead and let it base it on the profile that was built for that camera and that lens. Alright, now everything else I don't want you to really mess with at this point. I don't think it's necessary, and we're going to get into a lot more of how to use these images in Photoshop, but I just want to make sure of a couple more things that you notice. You can look at this image as a before and after, right? I can flip that. I can look at it in top bottom, right? A bunch of different ways. I can split screen. I can actually, I think yeah, there you go. You can do this, and it'll show you before and after with that image. Okay, it's pretty dynamic. It's got a lot that it can offer you. Okay, now you do have the ability to open this image or save it as is right now, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this image into Photoshop, which it will load from here to Photoshop. But then I want to take you back real quickly to Adobe Bridge, and I want to show you this little icon here. See this little icon? That icon lets me know that this image has been edited in Camera Raw. And watch this. If I open this again here and open it back up into Camera Raw, it has recorded the edits that I've made in Camera Raw in a non-destructive way. Okay, so this is a non-destructive form of editing that allows me to come back into Camera Raw and say, you know what, I really want this to be a little less exposed. And then I can open that, and it'll update that file, right? See, it made a duplicate. Okay, so this was slightly before, this is after. I'm going to close that one, say don't save. Alright, now I'm in RAW right now, and the workflow is we've set so far is the very first thing I like to do is duplicate this layer, have that background copy, and because I'm in RAW, I want to get into my edit mode. So I go to File, Save As, and I'm going to save this as my PSD file. Alright, so I'm going to go to my file structure for assignments, say it's long 1, PSD, and I'm going to save it here. Alright, and when I do that, it's going to change this up here to a .psd. And then I'm ready to do whatever creative edits I want. Take that into my print form, okay, which is a TIFF. Take that into my web form, which is a JPEG. All right. Now, so we have those 4 different files. We have the raw file, which at this point is literally a raw formatted image that's been edited non-destructively in Adobe Camera Raw, okay, which I can then open again, like I said, and I can reset this. So I can say, you know what, I don't want any of that, so, or maybe I want it black and white now. And I open that file. It's going to open it separately, okay, as a black and white. Okay, so it's very powerful. It's a very powerful way of making photographic images with as much data as possible. It gives you a lot of latitude, and I think you're going to really appreciate the power it yields you in editing your photographs.